Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's program. I'm Kat Lloyd, Vice President of Programs at the Tenement Museum, and we're so honored to be offering this program as part of Open House New York weekend. It's one of my favorite weekends in the city. And we're really excited to hear from you, hear your questions and thoughts about our program today. So please know you can use the chat at any time to ask questions, share comments with us. And normally we, on Open House Weekend, open our physical doors to bring visitors into 97 Orchard Street and 103 Orchard Street, our Tenement Museum buildings. But this year, our main building at 97 Orchard Street is undergoing a major preservation project. So we use this opportunity to bring you into the preservation process and share a little bit of behind the scenes of what's been going on in 97 Orchard Street as we give it some much needed TLC. So we'd love to hear in the chat if you have visited the Tenement Museum before. So you can just let us know where you're visiting from and whether you have come to the museum on site on Orchard Street. And probably as many of you know, the Tenement Museum really began as an idea. Our founders, Ruth Abram and Anita Jacobson, had this idea that there could be a museum about tenements, about the people who had lived in tenements. And so 30 years later, we have been bringing that vision to life in our tenement buildings at 97 and 103 Orchard Street. But we could have started in really any tenement building in the Lower East Side. And Ruth and Anita happened to find 97 Orchard Street in 1988. And that building had been empty as a home for about 53 years. So the beginning work of the museum was to look at this building, do research into who had lived there, but also start to learn about the structure and make it so that we could invite visitors in. And so we've been over the last 30 years really providing care and funding to make this building accessible for visitors, which is in itself kind of amazing, right? The building was never built to be a museum. So this kind of funding and care for a tenement building as a working class home was really something that had never been done before in the United States. So the project that we're doing now has really been the product of 30 years of learning about the building, learning what we need to do to the building to make it a museum for the next 50 years and to really future-proof it. So today's program, normally we do these in the evening. So in my mind, it's always like tonight. But today's program, we will get to hear from two of the experts on 97 Orchard Street. Dave Favaloro is our Senior Director of Curatorial Affairs, and Lana Dubin is our Collections Manager. So you'll get to hear from both of them and really see, what our process has been up to this point to take care of the building, and then also what's happening now, right? How are we learning more about the building and preparing it to be a museum for the next couple of generations? So it is my pleasure to introduce Dave and Lana. And again, please feel free to share your questions, your comments in the chat. I see a couple have come in already, and we will get the conversation started. So Dave, Lana, take it away.
Great.
Thank you so much, Kat.
Yeah, thanks, Kat. And so I'm going to let Lana bring up some slides as we kind of introduce this morning's presentation or program. And, I think Kat did a really great job kind of summarizing the overall content we'll be tackling. And really, like the sort of core question we're going to consider in this sort of tour of 30 years of history at the Tenement Museum is this kind of core question of how do you turn what was in 1988 a mostly vacant mid-19th century tenement building into a museum that is visited by thankfully lots of people. So as Kat mentioned, we're in the midst of a really exciting current project, and of course here is 97 Orchard Street today, before construction, and kind of is our starting point, I think. But yeah, we'll really kind of tackle this question of how, how did we go from, a mostly vacant building in 1988, its residential floors having been closed by that point for 53 years, since 1935, when the building and the owner at that time refused to comply with some important housing laws that we can talk about a little bit as well. But what is the kind of core work that we've done to date and continue to do to make this building both safe and I think in terms of like preserving the really important interior historic fabric and exterior historic fabric, which is an essential tool for our museum educators in terms of interpreting the stories of the folks who once called this building home. So you can go advance there. Thank you. So interestingly, there are not many quote historic photographs of 97 Orchard Street in the way that you'd probably think of them, but our sort of touchstone is this 1940 New York City Department of Finance tax photograph that depicts the building just a few years after the residential floors were closed. And as you might remember, I just said, right, like mostly vacant for that 53-year period. And that's because, as you can see here, the stores remained open really for the duration of the 20th century. So the upper residential floors of what is effectively a 5-story residential tenement building built in 1863 that then was, effectively condemned, if not officially, in 1935. All the residents evicted, and only the 4 commercial spaces that you see here on the first floor, and the kind of the ground floor on either side of the stoop. And you can see some of the folks who just happened to be passing by on that day in about 1940. Go to the next slide, thanks. The counterpoint to that is that the city also took photographs of every single building for tax assessment purposes. About 40 years later, in the mid 1980s, so really just before the building became a museum. And here, of course, you can see 97 Orchard Street from a different vantage. The stores, of course, still open. The sort of different businesses operating there, but the residential floors looking even more closed off, right? All of the windows boarded up, although the fire escape still remained, and some advertising had been added there. But this is really sort of like the other quote historic. I suppose many of us would think of the 1980s as historic. Now it being 40 years in the past, but this is the sort of last quote historic photograph before this building became a museum. And Kat was talking a little bit about this sort of notion that the Tenement Museum, like a lot of museums, I think, began as an idea rather than as a building or a collection of objects or artwork or what have you. And this is Anita Jacobson, one of the co-founders of the museum, who with her co-founder and the first president of the Tenement Museum, Ruth Abram, found the Tenement Museum after having searched for a building that would suit the sort of vision they had, and having enough historic fabric left intact on the residential floors and the commercial spaces of the building, and also having kind of the ability to access the building from the street from either side, which we can talk a little bit about as well. But this is Anita on one of the sort of vacant floors of the looking one of the hallway toilets, and you kind of get a sense, I think, of like what the spaces look like, and this in some ways is in like our starting point for how do you turn, what were they thinking about, what were the kind of questions they were raising, what was the work they did, and how that work unfold over the next 30 years in terms of how to turn this building into a museum. And Lana's going to bring up a really exciting kind of 3D essentially scan of one of the what we refer to as ruin apartments in the building. Maybe you had to go back, right?
Yep.
Well, I'll
Let
describe.
us.
I'll
All right.
describe as you bring that up what we're going to be looking at. We want, for particularly for folks who have never had the opportunity to visit the museum, we wanted to give you all a sense of what the interior spaces look like in terms of the layout. And one of the sort of early decisions that the museum made in a building that I said is 5 stories with 4 apartments per floor, all of those apartments, 3 rooms and approximately 325 square feet. 2 of those apartments in the sort of original kind of planning would be restored to depict the homes of families who lived in this building between 1863 when it was built and 1935 when it was closed, but some would be left in this kind of as found condition, the state the building was in when Ruth and Anita rediscovered the building in 1988. And recently we've worked with a really terrific firm called SOE, who's used kind of photogrammetry to scan these apartments and allow us to kind of take you through them in a kind of 3D sort of way. But we'll look at a couple of these throughout the time we spent together this morning. But this kind of gives you a sense of what the quote ruin or unrestored apartment on the 2nd floor of 97 Orchard Street looks like. You can see these on some of our tours when we reopen, of course. But what's really interesting about this, and I think what we'll kind of probe throughout the course of the time we spend together this morning, is how do you preserve the interior historic fabric of this building in what is a really kind of advanced state of deterioration, like halt the deterioration and leave this in this kind of as found state, all these sort of peeling layers of paint and wallpaper. And we'll talk about how we do that. And really, I think what are the kind of interesting questions and philosophies at the heart of the work and the things we sort of think about. But yeah, I'll just give you a kind of sense of what that looks like. I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
No, thanks, Dave. And just apologies in advance for my driving. It's a new technology that we're getting used to, and it's really exciting, but we're getting used to it, as we said.
Yeah,
All
we can
right.
go ahead there. Yeah, so thanks. This is a photo in the sort of mid 1990s that shows the exterior of 97 Orchard Street. The museum, got its start really by renting one of the storefronts that was vacant. Anita and Ruth had, as I said, had this idea for a tenement museum. They were looking for a building that would sort of suit the vision that they had, but really didn't have much success in finding a building, which is interesting, right? Because there were lots of buildings on the Lower East Side that were vacant on the residential floors, if not the full building in the 1980s. But the thing that they also needed was street access from both the front and the rear to allow this to be a museum that the public could visit safely and comply with all the kind of safety laws and egress regulations and so on. And so you can see the Tenement Museum sign at the top left storefront there, but they really hadn't begun by this point in the kind of early 1990s to work on the upper residential floors. You can see all the windows kind of still closed off there. And what we're going to talk about a little bit here is this idea that, right, the museum, in a way, I think that has lent itself to our ongoing kind of learning and developing a sort of process for the ongoing preservation of this building. Did so in a phased way, right? So floor by floor, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go on. So kind of learning throughout, really opening each floor of the building, beginning with the 2nd floor as we go. But here's a quote from Ruth Abram, the co-founder and first president of the museum in 2014, that I think really gets to the sort of like heart of the conundrum, which is, of course, here she's saying, I'm all for doing as much, meaning preservation, as possible, but not to the exclusion of letting people in. The idea from the beginning was we're inviting the American public home to meet their families, and you don't invite people home and have velvet ropes separating from the place. And right, I think, I certainly have been to historic house museums where you can't enter the room because rightfully perhaps the staff of that institution doesn't want damage to take place to the room or the collections or what have you. But I think at the beginning the idea was not only letting people into the places that their quote families lived as Ruth was pointing out there, but the experiencing and sort of engaging what it might have been like for the families who called 97 Orchard Street home, who might be like lots of other families who called the Lower East Side home during this period of time. What it was like to create a life in a new place in these conditions, in these 325 square foot 3-room apartments, right? You sort of can't, I think, put yourselves in the shoes of those individuals unless you stand inside those spaces. But that raises another question for us, which is the chief agent of deterioration are the people themselves, right? Sort of passing through these spaces. And so we've wrestled with how to kind of balance that that kind of core tension throughout over the last 30 years. And we'll talk a little bit about kind of specific things we've done and continue to do as part of the current preservation project now underway there. So yeah, this is a photo again in the kind of mid 1990s. Shortly after the second floor is open there, you can see the 4 second floor windows. By this point, the museum had also really taken over or become able to rent and use all of the former storefront spaces, and really had unveiled its first tour on the second floor of the building, which included the recreated Baldizzi apartment, the recreated Gumbert's apartment tour we for many years have called Hard Times. In the past, if you've visited many years ago, it might have been called Getting By, but 2 restored apartments, one set to 1935, the other set to the late 1870s, and one of which we saw in that kind of 3D scanned version, a kind of unrestored or ruined apartment. But yeah, just this idea that, right, we've sort of operated or kind of brought a floor online, doing all the kind of work you would need to do, not only from a preservation and restoration perspective, but from a safety perspective. How do you sort of make this building safe for the visiting public without destroying the really essential historic fabric that's important to the kind of interpretive work? So of course that included all sorts of things like fire sprinklers and new windows, right, went into all these floors. This is a little bit later, 2008, when new windows went up on the 4th and the 5th floors, which were the sort of last floors to be brought online on the residential portion of the building. The sort of basement commercial space was brought online in 2012. So, to date, that was really before the current project, last large scale work that happened in the building. But as you'll see, I think for us this work is really sort of ongoing and never finished, and we're continually evaluating if we're striking the right balance between preservation and access for visitors to the interior spaces of this building, and sort of trying to figure out what that is. One example of that, even on the exterior, is the kind of storefront facade on the lower floors of the building were first restored to its circa 1915 appearance in 2000, but we've continually had to go back and refinish that, conduct repairs to what is a kind of wood storefront facade in this case that uses a sort of like faux wood grain painting scheme. And here is our longtime restoration carpenter, Kevin Groves, refinishing that storefront now a little bit less than 10 years ago. This was done in 2013 and 2014. So it's all for us an ongoing process. The interior ruin or unrestored apartments in the building looked very much like this when the museum's founders first entered, not only in a state of kind of advanced deterioration, but lots of stuff on the floors, and so there's quite a bit of work on each floor. This in particular is on the 3rd floor of the building. We'll talk a little bit about the apartment that was restored in this space. But yeah, this in some ways is like the complete starting point for a lot of that kind of work as it's unfolded over the last 30 years. In fact, this is staff right before that in that same space, same apartment, I should say. The kitchen we were just seeing in that previous photo. This is the kind of parlor or front room area of that 3-room apartment. And this is in the center there, restoration carpenter Kevin Groves with some of the former staff of the museum, in the late 1990s, really sort of thinking about and talking through what the right approach would be to kind of restore this. And our approach, really relies on deep investigation into the building, its construction, its sort of decoration, and that, I think, in some important way sort of informs how we think about the process for restoring, say, this space would be restored, as you'll see, to what we believe it looked like in the late 1890s. When a family named Levine, Polish-Jewish family, lived in the building and operated a garment factory out of their home. Here is our longtime consulting furnishings curator, Pamela Keach, kind of painting the parlor mantle. And we'll talk about, as an example, how do we figure out what colors these spaces were, the trim, the fireplace, surrounded mantles you just saw. At particular moments in time. I have long worked with one particular firm, Jablonski Building Conservation, who, in addition to helping us preserve the historic fabric, also assist with the kind of ongoing investigation. And so this is a like a close-up slide of a paint sample that was taken, and they really, do more science than many of us on staff are trained to do. And it almost looks like tree ring dating, where you could figure out what the paint color might have been in a particular year. And they also then sort of work in so we'll go, we can look at this, sorry. This is in that same space, and really, not only determining from the actual sample and the slide, where they do things like obviously look at under high level microscope, but also use things like UV light to really sort of get a better sense, the best sense of what the color scheme might have been at any particular time. But sometimes, like there is not only a color, but a varnish and other things added on. So they'll sort of in particular places, as is shown right here on one of the pieces of trim on the parlor closet in that same apartment, sort of taking some of that varnish back, kind of revealing very carefully, so we can kind of learn as much about what that color scheme should look like. And that is still there in that same apartment as a kind of teaching tool as well, for us to incorporate the kind of preservation and restoration process into the tours and the storytelling itself. In some apartments, we need to completely replaster. Some of what we think about is, what is the moment in time being represented? What era in the building's history does that represent? As you might guess, right, if it's an apartment like is represented here, this is Kevin Groves, again, our longtime restoration carpenter, replastering to recreate or restore the Irish Moore family apartment in 1869, representing just 6 years after the building first opened. So the plaster, in that case, should not be in an advanced state of deterioration, should be relatively fresh, as a 6-year-old building or home should be. So here he's replastering using the same techniques that were used when the building was first built, including incorporating horsehair into the plaster itself. And luckily at that time, this was now about 15 years ago, but Kevin's daughter kept horses upstate, so he was able to get immediate access to real horsehair to incorporate into his plaster.
As authentic as possible.
As authentic, Exactly. And, this is the Levine apartment I mentioned as well. Here, wallpaper was suitable for the parlor, right? Because we have evidence from extensive analysis of the more than 20 layers of wallpaper that adorn the parlor walls throughout the building, that this was the pattern that appeared in the late 1890s, and we recreated that with the help of companies that we've worked with for many years. And we're going to bring up kind of a 3D so you can get a better sort of view of what this apartment looked like in sort of real time. But you can see here, this again is the recreated home of Harris and Janie Levine, and they're operating a garment factory out of their home.
Right. So it's the same layout as the other apartment that we saw earlier, 325 square feet, the size of a city school bus. And this apartment is chock full of objects, as it is a working factory. So we'll go to each room.
Yeah.
And you can see.
Yeah.
Oh, no, of course, Dave, go ahead.
We got a question that came in, which I think is sort of relevant to what we're talking about here, which is, when renovating, did you use historically accurate material? And I think, the question is generally, a mix of yes and no, right? As I said, so the plaster is a really good example of using techniques and materials that are akin to what was used originally. We use the same kind of paints, right? Depending on the different period of time, different paints were used over the course of the building's history. We've obviously reproduced wallpaper in some respects, but with other things like the lighting, right? We're not using gas. In some cases it would have been gas lighting, but in this particular case, you'd say, yeah, sorry, I should have said it would have been kerosene lamps, but they've been, retrofitted to use electricity, right? So that, I think that's a good example. But yeah, I think generally we try to use the same materials, the same techniques that were used originally, if they're available, and are able to be used. As I said, we're sort of in some ways kind of trying to not only be as historically accurate as possible, but wrestling with kind of long-term preservation questions, ongoing kind of public safety questions as well. So, I think the interesting thing is, if you visit things like the fire sprinklers that are modern, are visible throughout, not sort of hidden. I don't know if you can see any of those, right? Because I think we want to be there's one right there, right? So it's immediately hopefully sort of legible, if you will, that what's part of the sort of restoration or recreation, and what is a kind of contemporary or modern addition for life safety purposes.
Great. All right, let's go back. Okay.
Yeah, so I think we're always sort of conscious as well of wanting to be kind of to the question that was just asked, I think, be transparent about process, transparent about what was there prior to the restoration. And so, the museum has, since the beginning, even in these kind of restored apartments that are attempting to depict a particular moment in time in the life of the building and the life of a family, we've left what's called, and pictured here, kind of area of record that retains what that space sort of looked like prior to the restoration, really kind of, again, reminiscent of what that particular space looked like prior to, or at the moment, I should say, of, the museum's sort of discovery, if you will, of 97 Orchard. The process of thinking about, right, that in one hand is like restoration. How do we think about kind of long-term preservation, particularly, as I was saying earlier, right, in the sense of the unrestored, or what we sometimes call ruin apartments, and this has been an ongoing process of assessing, of stabilizing, reassessing, and so on. What's depicted here is a conditions assessment, the sort of drawn copy of the conditions depicted by photograph at the lower right, and the drawn sort of version at the top left there. And this again was done by the folks at Jablonski Building Conservation. Now, counting in my head here how long ago it was, right? It's like 17 or 18 years ago. And this, was an effort, right, to sort of understand conditions at that point, and then use that as a basis for testing different kinds of treatments. It's not, even for the conservators we work with, I think, the treatments that would be used to in some ways kind of arrest ongoing decay, they're not typical, right? I think sometimes that is done in historic sites. We have, a large number of these spaces, a lot of historic fabric to sort of stabilize. And so, part of this is documenting conditions, studying them, and really developing techniques that are in some ways kind of unique to this building to kind of stabilize on an ongoing basis. So this is really sort of like the starting point for that. And this is one of the techniques, you saw in the last photograph, the condition they found. Part of that was like a plaster coming away or bowing away from the wall, had been disconnected from the strips of wood, which are called lath, and wet plaster ordinarily, and when it's new, sort of presses against that, pushes out to the other side, hardens to form what are called keys, and that stays hopefully for many years. But if anybody's lived in homes with plaster walls, plaster, over time, cracks and buckles just because of, a variety of different, from vibration, from temperature changes, from, any number of different things. And of course, that's what happened here. But we don't want to put new plaster in this particular space. It's not an apartment that's being restored to a particular moment in time. We want to freeze this sort of unrestored or ruined apartment and really interpret the kind of layered historic fabric there. And so here, what they really did was, use a variety of products, including a piece of what's called ethofoam or foam that kind of got tucked in between that void there, and then used the kind of conservation grade spackle that they painted afterwards to sort of blend in a little bit better. And that, as an example, has been stable for, almost 20 years. But we continually reassess this on an ongoing basis. Lana, myself, and the curatorial department do a regular kind of monitoring and documentation. And if we have questions, of course, refer them to conservators. The wallpaper, I mentioned there's over 20 layers in some of these apartments. And so how do you stabilize that? They've developed ways, using kind of just pieces of sort of like acrylic pins to make the, I think interestingly, like make the stabilization itself visible, but in as low kind of impact a way as possible. You can also see the piece of string there, which is another part of kind of how we think about this. We don't, again, want to prevent visitors from entering these spaces, but by putting a kind of really small string barrier directly in front of the wall, that prevents folks from inadvertently leaning against the wall. Incidentally, I also love the bird, if anybody can see the bird in the wallpaper there. Yeah, thanks, Lana. I think that's super cool. Yes, this is another great example of a condition, right? Some plaster wallpaper had begun bulging. On the left is the original condition. On the right is the kind of treated and restored and stabilized piece. And we're going to play a short clip of one of our longtime conservators from Jablonski Building Conservation, Stephanie Hoagland, talking about that process and really, I think, in an interesting way, reflecting on her work at the museum, which gives you a kind of the expert perspective, more expert, yes, than than us, the conservators' perspective, I should say, right?
So JBC has been working with the tenement since 2005, and I came in with JBC in 2003, and so it was absolutely amazing to kind of walk into these spaces that have kind of been empty for decades. Fortunately, this building is incredibly popular. It's an incredibly popular museum. Unfortunately, this building was never designed to handle the amount of people that come up and down those stairs every day. And so over time, it's part of the ceiling building. Can you count right away? Really, the first rounds of stabilization were just re-putting up the wallpaper and, kind of making it visually still look ruinous, but the damage is not continuing. And now we're getting more into true stabilization, where we're consolidating the ceilings and we're consolidating the walls, because they're still continuing to move. And so it's more about saving the entire space versus just this piece of wallpaper. And so we've had to kind of stretch our idea of good conservation practice. There have been times when we've worked in a room, and the best thing is when someone comes in and is like, did you guys even do anything in here? And we're like, yes, everything is now great. And they're like, good, because it still looks like a mess, but it's a stabilized mess. So it's all good.
That's great. Thanks, Lana. We had another question come in while you're bringing the slides back up. I'll speak to, which is, how long did the restoration take? And I think that's an interesting question because it's been sort of phased in a way. So, the process of, quote, restoring the full building, I think, interestingly, has taken us almost 30 years. But on an individual basis, if you're asking sort of like, how long does one apartment take to restore from its original as found condition to what it looked like, say, in the 1890s, as we were talking about, that's the process, including research and all of the sort of investigative and planning work, is a 5 to 7 year process generally, but the actual sort of physical work is anywhere from 6 months to a year, I think.
My name is Jen.
I'll just introduce this. So I'll introduce this here. So, one of the things Stephanie Hoagland from Jablonski Building Conservation just mentioned is the sort of ceilings. And one of the things we began to see probably about 10 years ago, I think, as the museum, she was referencing this as well, became, she used the word sort of popular, but I think a highly visited museum, probably about 10 or 15 years ago on our visitorship, thankfully, increased exponentially year over year, which is something obviously we want to see the visiting public and to tell them the stories of 97 Orchard Street and now, of course, 103 Orchard Street. But that, as we've been talking about, has a kind of impact on the ongoing sort of preservation of the building. And so, we started to see small pieces of plaster ceiling fail or fall. Luckily, no full sort of plaster ceiling never fell in a kind of, quote, catastrophic way. But what we're going to show you is sort of time-lapse video of a process that Jablonski Building Conservation has now done in a number of the different apartments and will be doing as part of our current project in other spaces, of really stabilizing the ceilings in place. This is the Gumpert's apartment, or restored Gumpert's apartment, intended to depict the home of a German Jewish family in the late 1870s on the second floor. I think what's interesting here is the same thing Stephanie was just saying, right? Like, the goal is to have it look as if not, the same as when you began, which is really different than I think a lot of us experience sort of like renovation projects, right? So you can go ahead and play the...
Hello, my name is Danielle Swanson, and I'm the collections manager at the Tenement Museum. On the evening of May 31st, a sizable piece of ceiling plaster in the parlor of the Gumpert's apartment was lost near an area where a historic decorative scroll was painted. The next morning, architectural conservators from Jablonski Building Conservation assessed the damage and temporarily stabilized the area. After this assessment, it was determined that repairs to the plaster were necessary. Employees from John Tiedemann Incorporated installed a pipe scaffolding system and platforms in the kitchen and parlor of the Gumpert's apartment. Conservators from Jablonski then installed microjacks in the pipes that are systematically tightened in order to support the plaster ceiling from below and push it slightly back towards the wood lath above. Once complete, restoration carpenter Kevin Groves removed the floorboards from the Levine apartment. Dirt and debris that were resting on the plaster ceiling were carefully removed by conservators, documenting any objects or materials found that should be collected as part of the museum's permanent collection. The plaster is then sprayed with an acrylic resin to help re-harden the surface and allow it to move with future vibrations. Once set, an adhesive material called lug and key is applied between the gaps of the wooden lath, allowing the plaster to re-adhere to its surface. When this process is complete, Kevin Groves will reinstall the floorboards, the scaffolding will be removed, and the curatorial team will reinstall the apartments. Over the last 30 years, the museum has worked with various people who are dedicated to preserving the building as well as telling the stories of the people who live there.
Great. Yeah, so we'll of course talk about the current project, but we've done that. That process that was just described has been undertaken in a number of apartments throughout the building over the last several years, but we will be kind of doing that comprehensively to ensure all of the plaster is essentially stable. One more, I think, forward. There you go. And it's okay. There you go.
All right, there we go.
So the idea, I think likewise that we've sort of done approach all of this work in a really kind of phased way, kind of learning along with the folks who we work with, both internal and external, like Jablonski Building Conservation as we go. It's a really important kind of factor. This is work depicted here that was done in the first floor hallway, which I think is really for a lot of folks, including myself, having visited the museum prior to joining the staff now almost 20 years ago. The first floor hallway is a really sort of impactful and sort of a visually arresting space, left effectively in the state that it was rediscovered in 1988, but it's needed, some important kind of stabilization work done first in the late 1990s. And what you're seeing here, likewise, also done by Jablonski Building Conservation, is treatment of these sort of roundel or medallion paintings. On the left was the original condition, kind of covered with sort of decades worth of soot and from the coal stoves that many residents had while the building was occupied. On the upper floors, the residential floors, just dirt and sort of grime and so forth. And then on the right side is this sort of treated or restored condition. These were added to the hallway circa 1905. And depict, interestingly, I think, kind of rural scenes. So we have a number of these throughout the hallway, some of which have been restored, others have left in this condition, to show both conditions. And I think that's a really kind of important principle as well, really sort of being transparent about the work and so on. The work in the first floor hallway has also been structural. This is Russell Powell from a firm called Island House Rights, who do sort of specialty historic carpentry, working on the first floor stair in 2005 and 6. And so, he literally removed nails from the original holes, like labeled them and all the various pieces of the stair that he took apart to kind of stabilize the structure of it, so it continued to serve kind of as a pathway for visitors to access the upper floors. So it was structurally stable, but looked the same. He put those same historic nails into the same original hole, so as if nothing had happened. We'll be doing that throughout the course of the current project. That was done only in under 2005, on the first to second floor. We'll be doing the rest of the floors. So maybe if you go back just one slide, Lana, to the all of the sort of handbills from the palmist, Dora Meltzer, who was a resident East European Jewish immigrant who operated a palmist studio at 97 Orchard in the very early 20th century. And we found a number of these handbills throughout the building, but a large number of them were also discovered as part of that kind of stairwell work. So we're really excited that during the current project, we're going to be opening up floors, opening up the stairs, and are hopeful that we will find all sorts of interesting objects sort of left behind, if you will, by the former residents and shopkeepers of the building. Yeah, this is another example of a floor cavity, sort of like chock full of debris, largely, broken pieces of plaster, a variety of kind of like bones and stuff. But also, we collect all this as part of these projects. We'll continue to, and we kind of sift through it, and these objects really form a kind of core part of the museum's artifact collection. This is an example of one of the things found in that particular floor cavity on the 3rd floor back in 2013 as part of one of the early kind of ceiling stabilization projects. And this is a ticket to high holiday services at a nearby, now no longer existing synagogue. What else we got? Yeah, I think, as I was saying, about 10 or so years ago, when we started to really kind of grapple with some of these small pieces of ceiling failing, and to work with, not only conservators, but structural engineers, architects, all sort of from preservation-oriented practices to help us kind of think about this. We've sort of brought them together as part of a committee and a project study, if you will, funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Services now in the 2011, 2012. And one of the things our structural engineer from Robert Silman Associates, Rebecca Buntrock, suggested is that we do a kind of vibration monitoring study to really try to learn how nearby vehicular traffic was sort of vibrating the building, and also, staff and visitors sort of walking through it, right? What could we learn from that, right? What we were just seeing was a seismograph that we placed in various areas of the building, including on the 4th floor. And this is sort of the kind of data that came from that, and yeah, we could sort of pour over this for quite a bit, but you're kind of seeing one apartment there, and all of the sort of timed activity peaks set off by the vibration monitor, and some of the peaks you could see going above some of these lines. Some of these lines are different standards for vibration that would do damage to plaster, historic plaster, and just general sort of like intact new plaster by different various measurements, international and sort of local as well. And what we learned from that is that, the building, it's a wood frame building, meaning it has wood sort of beams or joists that span across the full part of the building, from the brick or masonry side walls or party walls that are shared with the neighboring buildings, and that those are, in some way moving, not in a dangerous way, right? I think, what we confirmed, or what our engineers told us, is that the building is safe, and the museum was really careful to make sure that the building was safe from a structural perspective as part of its initial work, bringing each floor online over the course of the building's use as a museum. But was this vibration kind of driving some of the loss of historic fabric that we were seeing? What we did next was open up parts of the floor to take a look at the actual structure. And this is Rebecca Buntrock, again, from Robert Silman Associates Structural Engineers, doing a kind of floor probe, looking at the floor. And what they discovered was that, because of, if anybody's ever heard the term deflection, right? Like it's an old building. Many of us have lived in buildings in New York and elsewhere that are old, and kind of the floors are not level, right? And that's because buildings sort of like it sags over time. That's not necessarily dangerous from a structural perspective, but what this told us was that there needed to be some repairs to help mitigate some of the vibrations that were happening, largely from people walking through the building in large numbers, which is something we want to see. We're not going to stop that, right? Because that's essential to the mission of the museum and the experience and really learning about the folks who once called the building home. But how could we sort of like undertake a number of structural repairs to ensure that the building sort of moved less? And what you're seeing here is just a diagram from the structural engineers of how they, with the repairs, that are currently underway will, establish a sort of stronger load path, excuse me, for the building. The work we're doing, likewise, currently it takes into account studies that have unfolded over the last 10 years of the building's exterior. What you're seeing here is kind of a brownstone windowsill. You can see the cracks in there, right? So we're going to bring up another kind of 3D photogrammetry scan, very similar to the one we initially saw earlier of the ruined apartment of the exterior. And I'll talk a little bit about the kind of exterior work that is currently contemplated. I think this is a really cool kind of visual with which to do that. The goal of, I think, any his exterior restoration or repair as part of a historic house or historic building should be water tightness. Like, water is the enemy of any number of building materials, but in this particular case, we'll be replacing the roof that you could see here. We are going, if you can go to the front part of the facade for a second there, Lana.
Sure.
You can see in the middle there.
Just,
Bear.
Just a little patience there as I drive around on this new technology.
So yeah, you see the front of the building. We're going to be replacing all of the windows, with windows that are energy efficient and block UV lighting that can cause damage to, historic wallpaper and collections, reduce things like solar heat gain for heat. The brownstone windowsill I just mentioned, right? All of the brownstone window sills, which are the bottom part of the window, and the lintels, which are the kind of top part of the window, will be replaced with new ones. Interestingly, at some point prior to the building becoming a museum, the original window sills and lintels protruded from the face of the building. They were shaved back, probably because they were already deteriorated, and that was a less expensive thing to do for the building owner at that point in time. But we'll be kind of restoring the profile of the brownstone lintels and sills to their original sort of profile there. Mm-hmm. And then a range of other things, including repairing some cracks and so forth that have occurred over the course of the building's history. And on the rear as well, you can see our rear fire tower, which will get some needed TLC as part of this, some cracks and so forth. Will be pretty interesting. On the rear facade, the sills and lintels are not brownstone, but they're bluestone, which has held up. Probably doesn't look as nice, which is why they use them on the back, but some of those will be repaired as part of this. And I think maybe let's go to the roof for 1 second. We'll just take a look. You can see the top of the building air shaft to the right. The sort of skylight thing that you see on the left is the top of the stairs that go from, we were talking about earlier, go from the first floor or even the basement up to the roof that's there. But to the right of that is the kind of skylight or cap of the building's air shaft, which was installed in 1905 to comply with the 1901 Tenement House Act. Included, it's sort of the toilets or the water closets that were also required and installed in that year, sort of back onto that, if you will, and have windows likewise that open on. And so, one of the things that has always been a kind of question or a conundrum for the museum has been both how to and should we in some way climate control the interior of the building, both for preservation. Yeah, here's some of the cracks and so forth, if you want to kind of page to those as we go through and talk a little bit.
I'm going to get to the air shaft.
Yeah, so there's one of the bluestone that's cracked. Yeah, so what we're also, so again, masonry repairs, but what I was just talking about is the air shaft here, and one of the kind of core conundrums for the museum or challenges has been, both should we say what you think of as like air condition the building, and if so, how to do that, and that question has been both raised and discussed with various members of the staff over the years, and also with a variety of different experts, some of whom I've mentioned. And so I think, of course, the thing that comes up is what is this is this quote unquote authentic or inauthentic? And because the people who lived there at the time never had any kind of air conditioning. But I think one of the things we've seen over the years, over the last 10 or more years, of course, is that the summers are hotter and longer. And so we've made the decision to, for the first time, I think, try to introduce some measure of cooling into the building. And the way we're doing that without destroying the historic fabric by running ductwork, which would be the normal way you would sort of do air conditioning, right, is to use a kind of HVAC unit on the roof and use the historic air shaft as a kind of vertical duct and deliver the air. As you can see, these sort of windows, just using the arrows, blue arrows on this diagram, really circulate that air, that cooled and dehumidified air kind of passively through the building using the various kind of existing windows and doors and openings of the building. So we're really excited. The idea here is it's not going to end up being as cool as your home or office during the summer months, right? Here's the air shaft again, but will be, the extremes will be mitigated and will be much more comfortable during the summer months for both visitors and staff. I think before I hand it over to Lana to just talk for a few minutes about the process of kind of moving some of the objects out of the building and what that was like prior to construction, is the other really exciting part of this project is a new exhibit that we'll be building on the 5th floor. Here's a drawing of one of the rooms, the kitchen of this exhibit. And this will, for the first time, allow the museum to tell the story of a Black or African-American family whose names were Joseph and Rachel Moore. Our research has never revealed a Black or African-American family who lived in the building, but they lived in a nearby tenement on what is the kind of lower west side, what used to be called the old 8th Ward, and shared a name with an Irish-born resident of the building, two Joseph Moores, if you will, which is really where the sort of idea for this came from visitors. And some of our educators really kind of grappling with a source that put those names together, the city directory in this particular case. So be really exciting to, for the first time, interpret the 5th floor. And for the first time, I think, really begin to tell the story of Black New Yorkers as tenement residents during the mid to late 19th century, effectively.
Mm-hmm. So Dave just took us through 30 years of preservation activities and then also let us know what is coming and what is ongoing right now and about to come. But in order to clean the building out and in order to have the windows replaced and the air shaft HVAC system put in, every single exhibit item needed to be cleared out. So we have a wonderful curatorial assistant, Koskaya Farfan, who assisted with this. And as you could see, every single object, this is in our Moore's apartment, was put into a box, wrapped, labeled, inventoried, and then that location was updated in our database. So every single object, all of the historic objects have numbers associated with them so that we could track them. So here are some very fit gentlemen from the moving company we worked with, which was Globe, and they were absolutely wonderful. And they're moving these substantial coal burning stoves down that exterior stair that you saw. So this one is coming from the 4th floor and they had to bring it all the way down. And I think Dave was quite happy that we hired someone because when Dave first started, they were setting up the exhibits and they had staff move all of these objects upstairs. So it was very exciting to have professional movers assist with this project. Here you can see Vito, my good friend. He's the foreman for this moving company, and they did an incredible job ensuring that every single object was taken care of, brought to their facility, stored, and then also made sure that everything was kept together. So when we are going back into the building, we are going to have to quickly bring everything back up those stairs, unwrap it, and reinstall it. And so it's very important that all of the rooms stayed together and all were color coded and labeled appropriately. So this is the Baldizzi apartment. This is on the second floor of 97 Orchard. And this, while we were thinking about what this preservation project would entail, we realized that closing 97 Orchard for 6 months, however long the project takes, was really unacceptable. We wanted to make sure that our visitors continued to see our families, interact with them, and that we can continue providing interpretation of these families and their lives. So we decided to use our current, our other tenement building, 103 Orchard, and recreate these exhibit spaces in that building. So this one is 97. And here is what it looks like in 103. So there are currently 3 pop-up exhibits, is what we're calling them, or sublets. The Baldizzis have moved out of 97 and they've moved right in. So some of these objects, these are exactly the same as they were in 97, just put in a completely different space. So what I'm going to do is show a video of how we incorporated historic fabric from 97 Orchard into this new pop-up exhibit in 103. And I will do that in just a second. So this is a video of Koskaya, our intern, and myself, and we are unrolling 100-year-old linoleum that had been preserved in 97, was kept on a large tube, and we decided to put this historic linoleum into the 103 Orchard exhibit. So the hair dryers were used to warm up the linoleum to make sure it wouldn't crack further than it already was. And then conservators had taken this tissue, a wet mount tissue, and they had adhered it to the face of the linoleum so that nothing would crack off. But we had to give it a sponge bath and remove all of this paper from the linoleum and then remove the light water-based adhesive. So here's what this beautiful linoleum rug looks like, and we're doing a little happy dance that we finished it.
This weird shape-shifting.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, I know we've gone a little long, but happy to take questions if folks have additional questions, right? I think that's the end of the, right?
That is the end of it. And unfortunately, I couldn't see the questions when we were doing the talk, but it seemed like it was a pretty
we had so many good questions. I ended up answering most of them in the chat.
Oh, good.
And pass those few along to you. But I just wanted to say thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Lana. And everyone, please stay in touch with us. We would love to have you at future virtual programs. We will be sharing information about what you saw, the hints of today about the Joseph and Rachel Moore exhibit, about the work on 97 Orchard Street. And we will have future programs like this as we go through this process. So please stay in touch with us. You'll see in the chat a link to sign up for our newsletter. And next week, even if you want to learn more about Dora Meltzer and about Jewish immigrant women who were working as fortune tellers, as clairvoyants in the Lower East Side, we have a program about the history there next week on Zoom. So sign up for our newsletter. You'll get information for how to join for that program. And thank you all so much for supporting us. These programs are only really possible because of your support. And of course, the support this weekend of Open House New York. So if you are able, we appreciate any size donations. There's a link in the description of this program. As you all saw, this is an incredible amount of work to take care of this building. And of course, that work requires funding. So your support helps us to continue to care for this building, continue to care for these stories, and to continue taking you behind the scenes of how we do all of this work at the museum. So we really appreciate you all tuning in on this morning or afternoon or evening, wherever it is you are. And take care. We hope to see you at a program soon.
Thank you all.